Hello, my name is Rex Lamore. I'm director of the Center for Community and Economic Development here at Michigan State University, and a member of a team of faculty here at MSU who are beginning to examine circular economy and the role of circularity in our state, nation, and the global environment that we find ourselves in. The concepts and practices of circularity in the use of materials is clearly an emerging field in academia, in industry, and in communities. And over the past few months, faculty at Michigan State University have begun to discuss ways that we can best serve our shared mission in research, outreach, and instruction to advance circularity. And I'd like to recognize a couple of members of our core team who have been helping us in this conversation. Dr. Aras Raphael, who is in packaging, Dr. Larry Drizal, who's with our College of Engineering, Professor Vedat Verder, who is in our School of Supply Chain Management, and some of our team members here at the center, Ms. Kelly Humes, Ms. Olivia Wheeler, and Mr. Toby Hayes. And as a way of building our collective interests in this emerging field, over the next few weeks, we will be and are hosting a series of informal conversations with key scholars on our campus whose thinking and doing in the field is notable and we're anxious to hear from. So today joining us are Professor Mark Wilson of the Urban and Regional Planning Program in the School of Planning, Design, and Construction. Dr. Wilson has a master's degree and a bachelor's degree from the University of Melbourne in Australia, received his doctorate at the University of Pennsylvania. He is also the director of the Planning and Design and Construction doctoral program, and his research interests address urban planning, information technology, economic geography, public policy, and nonprofit organization. He's been a global leader in asking questions related to mega events like Olympics and world fairs, and what happens to the infrastructure after those mega events, and how might that material be more wisely reused and salvaged. And today he'll be also sharing with us some of the work he's been doing in the area of transportation planning. I know he's been active in driverless vehicles, autonomous vehicles. And also joining us is Sandra Lupian. Ms. Lupian is director of MassTimber at MSU in the Department of Forestry and has over 15 years of diverse professional leadership experience in policy, strategy, and advocacy, public affairs, communications, outreach, and a number of other areas, campaign, journalism, and she served as Deputy Director of External Affairs with the California Governor's Office of Planning and Research, received her master's at the University of California in Berkeley. And she'll be joining us to talk about the opportunities that MassTimber provide for us in circularity.
Okay. So my topic today has morphed from what I told Rex, so I hope I haven't got you here on incorrect pretenses. But I realized that when I was thinking about closing the circle, that it's very difficult to make decisions when you don't know what is going to happen. And one of our PhD students in urban planning last year did his dissertation on uncertainty. And uncertainty has always been a topic that's interested me. And so I'm going to look at decision-making under uncertainty applied to transportation and some of the implications. So in some ways, this is more abstract, but the goal is to raise some issues around how do we make decisions when we don't know what's going to happen. And in particular, a lot of my work is associated with technology. And the problem with new technology is that it develops faster than we can recognize and plan for it. If we are not directly involved in the creation of a new technology, it's very hard to suddenly determine how we can use it. And we learned this in autonomous vehicles when we find engineering with decades of expertise and urban planning with 2 years of experience thinking about what happens to autonomous vehicles. And so for us to close the circle in planning around autonomous vehicles, we are really starting way behind. We have figuratively and literally missed the bus, and we are racing to catch up with the technology of the moment. So one of the things that we've been working on between engineering and social science at MSU is socio-mobility. It's linking those that study the social impacts of mobility, who are often late to recognize what new developments are coming, and to ally ourselves with engineering, which is creating the new developments that are coming. So it's putting the two pieces together. How do we plan for something that's new, if we want to close the circle on this new transportation, if we ourselves in planning don't know much about it and haven't really prepared? So it's addressing this gap in our knowledge that comes in the lag between a new idea being created and then those who are implementing it, realizing how it can proceed. So one of my inspirations in thinking through this is Erwin Schrödinger of the famous thought experiment. And I find Schrödinger particularly relevant when I think about urban planning and autonomous vehicles, because essentially autonomous vehicles can be locked in a box with the city, and it can be both good and bad. And so there are great positive scenarios I can spin for you, and there are daunting negative scenarios I can spin for you. Some close the circle on sustainability very effectively. Others take us in completely the wrong direction. So I find the Schrödinger concept of understanding decision-making when we don't know what the outcome could be, and when we look at new technology, we can see good and bad in it that influences how we sell it. And so when it comes to the urban planning of autonomous vehicles, it's not until we open the box and see whether autonomous vehicles have killed the city or whether in fact they have brought it to light. And we can look back at the history of the automobile and the way the automobile has killed some downtowns, killed many minority neighborhoods, promoted fragmentation of society. There have been many outcomes from the automobile that originally was thought of as being a positive force, yet we can also see it as being a highly negative force. So the future we look at is one that's both utopian and dystopian. And one of them we want to avoid, and one we want to emulate and hopefully succeed. So how do we do that around autonomous vehicles? So there are some things we dream of. And to me, this is closing the circle around autonomous vehicles, around it having a productive use of space in cities that will be beneficial to society in general. And so some of those dreams that we can have is improved access to mobility, especially for those that are unable to drive, who are too old or too young, or maybe have a disability. We can look to more efficient and sustainable transportation, that if we can promote ride sharing, there are fewer trips, new ownership models, fewer vehicles needed. The vast arrays of parking areas that we currently reserve for 8 hours use a day could be turned into something else. Can we turn our housing footprint into a smaller space because we no longer need garages? Can we increase density and better land use? And to me, one dream is that because of these changes that are coming, the closing of the circle is a reason to revisit our preferences with those we have in our community. And so it is an opportunity that we can grasp by saying, change is coming, join us, talk through what this change means. So some of the things that we can dream about and design is reclaiming streets for pedestrians, because we don't need as much road space for AVs. We can promote greater public transit, more space for bike paths, more space for wider sidewalks. We can take parking garages and turn them into something more productive. This is a Gensler idea to repurpose a parking garage as an office or condo setup. We can take shopping malls. This is the White Flint Mall redevelopment in Washington. The mall is being demolished and it is being replaced with essentially a new town that is heavily focused on pedestrians, mixed uses, that provides greater density, greater use of public transit, and it repurposes a vast area of parking lots that used to be around the mall. But we can also have nightmares. Apologies to Rex for his alma mater here. But we also have nightmares as well. Because if we don't close the circle, what happens? What goes wrong? So some of the nightmares we can have that we end up with more trips, we end up with more miles being driven, that we have vehicles running around empty, that people who are relieved of the pain of driving will live further away, and so vehicles will be traveling greater distances, that public transit that relies on large numbers of people going in the same direction may in fact not have the same support that it has today, that some groups can be marginalized. Anytime a new technology is introduced, it enters the agendas of those with an interest. And those agendas can be to disconnect or marginalize other groups within a society. We have issues of security and privacy because autonomous vehicles generate terabytes of data. But we'll also have a missed opportunity to talk about what the future of our cities is likely to be. And so we have downtown Lansing, a vast array of parking. It was the Crater City 2 years ago. And we're just going to leave this. Is it going to get weeds on it? Are we going to be innovative and turn it into something new if we don't use it? Or will it just lay there like so many strip malls that have been abandoned over the last couple of years and fester and essentially waste resources and waste opportunities? Are we going to end up with much less interest and demand in public transit because of a more fragmented travel policy, so that we don't have the same ability to be efficient in our public transit use? So how then do we close the circle? Because I've presented two sets of scenarios to you. One is a nightmare, one is a dream. Though my dream for some could well be the nightmare of the dense society they don't want to see happen. So in order to close the circle, we certainly have to know where we want to go. But how do we know where we're going if we've only had a few years experience with the technology? How do we know where it can take us? How do we know what is feasible? Which means that we have to add a change in mindset to something that is already in flux. So think about autonomous vehicles, think about work from home, a rapidly changing set of phenomena at the moment that will change cities. And at the same time, we have to change our mindset on top of a changing context in order to come to terms with it, to know where we need to steer ourselves. In addition to planning for mobilities in uncertainty, we want to add sustainability to the mix. It's not simply the transportation planning. We need to recognize that anytime we try to close the circle, there will be interests that don't want us to do so. They will want to have a different circle or a different direction in which to take your ideas, our ideas. And we need to engage with stakeholders in order to make this happen. But it then raises the issue of what happens when things go wrong. So instead of having a nice circular model, we have fragments. We have pieces of our vision scattered all over the place, difficult to repair because we cannot get a consistent direction that will achieve what we want. There will be places, there will be people, there will be goals that are left isolated by the changes we're trying to corral and to direct. And so clearly this is not what we want in transportation. This is a toll plaza, and immediately you enter the toll plaza, you enter the tail of a traffic jam. This is not what we want. This is a failure of our ability to plan and organize. But when things go wrong, do we have the courage to stop them where they stand? This is in South Africa, so the cars are actually on the correct side of the road. But do we have the courage to say no, the way some cities have, and say we started building, we started closing the circle on freeways and realized freeways were the wrong circle to be involved in. And so we take them down. And so we have to look at the courage of decision makers and the courage of institutions and political systems to say no. And sometimes we can achieve this. We can say no and stop something, but there are other times when we can't. So we have to think about what it takes, because closing our circle may in fact require us to stop other circles from reaching their closure or reaching their direction, because we are seeking something that is an alternative vision for our community. And so do we manage to close the circle? Can we be happy with a partially closed circle? How much closure is acceptable? How much closure can we achieve? Is almost good enough? Is almost better than nothing when it comes to how we see our society and the goals we have for it? And if we can close the circle, I want to suggest a book by Kat Holmes called Mismatch. And she looks at how inclusion affects design. And in particular, she notes that we have frequently closed the circle on design, and in so doing, excluded people from the process. So we may go into an idea of the future. We may have an idea of what it means to close the circle, but in doing so, we may in fact find later that we have excluded many people from our closure. Does our vision of closing the circle fully include people, or in fact, does our vision exclude people in its very nature? We could certainly close the circle, but does it mean that we have left people out of the process? And so this is a book about how design can and has not included everyone in the vision it has for the future. And for my last point, you remember I showed what failure looks like. This is an example of a Japanese art form called kintsugi. And in Japan, when things are broken, they can be repaired. And they are repaired visibly. And so that the areas that broke, the things we got wrong, remain visible when we have finished, as a reminder that what we have created is not perfect, but it incorporates the lessons we gained on the way that were far from perfect. So thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks again for inviting me to participate today, and to Dr. Wilson for really queuing up the conversation by creating those the concepts and the models and making that model of circularity fresh in our minds. I invite you to apply that model as you're thinking through what I'm saying here, and in what I think is probably a more hands-on presentation about what the heck we're doing with MassTimber at MSU, what is MassTimber, and what are the actions and opportunities here. So to start off, yes, I'm Sandra Lupien. I am the director of MassTimber at MSU. This program is a collaboration, and I am appointed across all three of the following entities: Department of Forestry, the School of Planning, Design, and Construction, and the Extension. And I think that this program operates across those three entities really underscores what we do, which is we mobilize education, science, outreach, and communication to really help advance mass timber construction and manufacture here in Michigan, and hopefully also in the surrounding region. What is mass timber? I'm going to be talking about mass timber, so I want to make sure we're all on the same page throughout the conversation. When I talk about mass timber, I'm referring to an umbrella term for a variety of engineered, panelized, and panelized is key, engineered panelized wood materials that can be used in building construction in both structural applications as well as non-structural and decorative applications. These are really large, strong, durable types of materials, and you're lucky because you can see an example of them in use at Michigan's first MassTimber building. This is the first one in the state, and it's right on MSU's campus. It's the STEM Teaching and Learning Facility at 642 Red Cedar Road. Now you're looking at this photograph and you're thinking, this is not a timber building. Where is the timber? I see bricks, I see glass, I see steel. Well, you're right. This is the outside of the building, which needs to match MSU's design aesthetic that's currently existing. But the inside of the building looks more like this. This is the building while it's under construction. But if you go in the building today, you will see much of this wood, with the exception of the floor decking in the picture. You'll see those columns, those beams, as well as those ceiling decks exposed in the building. So you can feel that warm feel of wood. Now, there are a number of different types of MassTimber. I'm not going to go over them all today. I'm just going to share with you the two types of MassTimber that are used in the STEM Teaching and Learning Facility. First is glue laminated timber, or Glulam. These are columns and beams made from pieces of dimensional lumber, just like 2x4s and 2x6s, which you're familiar with from building homes and making furniture, all the things that you already see in your home. These 2x4s or 2x6s are laid on top of one another, and then an adhesive is spread between each layer, and they're pressed together in a very powerful press to make really tall or really long columns and beams. These can be used on their own or with cross-laminated timber, which I'll talk about next, or in hybrid models with steel to make the structural system of a building, a large building, a much bigger building than a house. Cross-laminated timber, similarly to glue laminated timber, is dimensional lumber. This time it's stacked up into large panels, and each layer of the panel lies in the opposite direction of the one under it. So what we're doing is we're making perpendicular layers of dimensional lumber to create humongous panels that can create a wall or a floor deck. And the important thing to remember about MassTimber is when you're building with MassTimber, all of the pieces that you're going to use to build your big building come to the site prefabricated. The openings for windows are already cut out. The openings that you drill screws in to attach one piece to another already fabricated. So what ends up happening is that this building can go up a little bit like an erector set. It's very modular in its nature, and that can help save time when you're building buildings. So that's a little bit about what MassTimber is. And you can see this picture on the left showing a MassTimber building going up. So you can get a sense of kind of the scale of a cross-laminated timber panel, that piece with the big window that's going in. You can see the cross-laminated timber ceiling deck here. And then you can see glue laminated columns moving in a vertical direction. And there are many reasons that we're excited about MassTimber at MSU, and the state of Michigan in general is very excited about MassTimber. We're excited about them as building materials for opportunities in buildings. We're excited about the benefits that they may offer for jobs and the economy, and particularly in rural economies. And we're excited about them because they offer many benefits related to forests, climate, and sustainability if we're doing it right. I'm going to just start with architectural innovation, because I think a lot of innovation related to MassTimber in North America, as well as in Europe where it began, was driven by architects and just their excitement about using a new material and thinking about what they can do with it. You can see three very different building examples here. One is an office building in Minnesota. One is this beautiful organic U-shaped high-tech hub in the Netherlands. And then there's something as kind of mainstream, and maybe you don't normally think of this particular business as having architecturally innovative buildings, but a McDonald's in Chicago on the right. It's like the MassTimber design can really elevate the feeling and the coziness of any indoor environment. But now we're going to talk about the benefits in terms of when we're building with mass timber, because people are often like, oh, when you're building with wood, is it as strong as steel? Is it flammable? What's the deal with mass timber? And the truth is that mass timber is a high performance material. Because of its panelized, large format nature, mass timber is both very, very strong and considerably lightweight than a material like steel. But it doesn't have to be all or nothing, right? You can use mass timber in a hybrid system with steel and concrete. You can also use it on its own to create the structural system for a building. It also performs well in seismic testing, not super relevant in Michigan, but I did most of my research in California, where seismic resistance is a huge concern, and mass timber performs really well in earthquakes. And perhaps counterintuitively, the question most people always ask me first is, doesn't it burn up if there's a fire? Mass timber, in fact, is highly fire resistant, and that's because of that panelized structure, right? So if you put a big, thick, cross-laminated timber in a wall in your building, say it's 7 layers thick, and you put it into a fire test for 2 hours, what ends up happening is that those outer layers, which you can see here on the bottom right, will char, but the structural layers interior to those layers remain structurally intact. So your structural integrity remains. And referring to what Mark was saying, you can take off that charred outer layer and repair it, either visibly or invisibly, depending on what lesson you'd like to teach. With mass timber, you can often build faster and for less cost than with steel and concrete. This is not across the board, it's not all the time, but what we're seeing in research in North America, in Europe, is that because there's typically fewer components to assemble, because the components arrive flat packed and pre-cut, you can often reduce construction time significantly, in some cases by 15 to 20%. Like I said, that's not across the board, that's not a blanket statement, but we're seeing that in many cases. And again, you can use fewer people to put up the building, and usually fewer or less robust types of tools, like maybe you can use a smaller crane on your building site because it doesn't weigh as much. Some benefits for jobs in the economy, this using forest materials in buildings, particularly in a value-added product like mass timber, can create new revenue for all types of forest owners, whether they're commercial, family, or publicly owned forests. And Michigan has all those types of forest owners here. It can create new jobs in mass timber manufacture and fabrication, as well as in building construction, new types of jobs, or retraining of certain types of carpentry jobs, or even jobs for lower skilled employees to bring them onto building sites in new ways. And it can revitalize existing employment sectors like the forestry sector, like the timber sector, where milling and kilning are very underutilized industries at this time in Michigan. So we could help revitalize those. But the reason that Michigan as a state, MSU in particular, and now the building construction industry is so excited about mass timber is for the potential benefits for forests, climate, and sustainability. And this is where circularity really comes into play. So I want you to be thinking as I talk about these, about, kind of, if we do this right, what does it look like? And if we do it wrong, what does it look like, right? I think there's a lot at stake when we're talking about these particular benefits. So, there we go, animation. So when we talk about benefits on forests, we're talking about creating new markets for wood. When we create new markets for wood, what we're doing is we're adding new value to forests. And perhaps counterintuitively, what this can do is help us keep forests as forests, right? When we're using wood for high value uses, we're preventing forests from being converted to other types of less beneficial uses like parking lots or subdivisions, other types of uses that we've historically seen forests be converted into that we would like to avoid converting them into in order to maintain the significant carbon and ecosystem benefits of forests. Creating these markets supports ecologically responsible, sustainable forest management that can help increase fire and climate resilience, and climate resilience in forests, and help control invasive species that can very much harm or kill trees and forests. And it can help support rural livelihoods and economies when we are creating these new markets for high value wood products or value added wood products. You probably all know this. You learned it at some point in your educational career. Some of you are in forestry. David Dio, you're going to correct me. But what ends up happening, you know, the way forests engage with carbon and are part of the carbon cycle is that, you know, we all know that trees absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, a gas, as part of photosynthesis, and they expire oxygen, which we breathe, as part of their process. Wood is 50% carbon, right? The tree stores that carbon dioxide in its branches, in its leaves, in its trunks, in its roots, and eventually in the soil as carbon. When trees decompose or burn, that carbon dioxide returns to the atmosphere. And when forests are too dense, have too much wood in them, or have experienced, you know, a pest infestation because of having too much forest density or some you know, climate exacerbated drought or something like that, it's likely that trees will burn or die. And then we lose that carbon into the atmosphere where it can contribute to climate change. Managing forests in a sustainable way so that we are being strategic about which trees we're removing when to maximize their carbon benefits in the forest, or maximize their carbon benefits by taking them off the forest and holding their carbon in the products we make from them, is a very good strategy for really extending the climate benefits of trees. And I would argue, and I don't think it's a hard argument to make, that using them in mass timber, a product that can live in a building for 50, 100 years, is a very high value use for wood when it comes, when we're talking about it from a climate and carbon perspective. Furthermore, buildings and the construction industry together account for 39% of CO2 emissions by sector, according to this 2015, this graphic from 2015. That's a really large share. So if we can reduce the carbon impacts of our buildings, we can reduce the embodied carbon in our buildings. If we can reduce the amount of you know, carbon that we're using to produce and mine, when we're talking about steel or concrete, our building materials, that's a big win, and that can have a big impact. Oh, vestigial animation. I apologize for that. So it's important to just have an example of some of the potential impacts of using mass timber for carbon storage in buildings. So in our STEM building on campus, we use 3,000 cubic meters of mass timber. And that is mass timber that comes from sustainably harvested forests in Quebec from a company called Nordic Structures. This mass timber is certified by the Forest Stewardship Council, which is the most well-respected forest product certification system in the world. And that means that we are storing 1,856 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents in our STEM facility, which is like not driving the average vehicle, autonomous or not, either about 4.7 million miles total, or not burning a whole lot of coal, more than 2 million pounds of it. And you know, while that's not going to stop climate change by itself, in the aggregate, if we start building a significant share of our buildings using mass timber, then we'll start making a dent in this sector that has already a high impact on CO2 emissions. We are seeing mass timber use growing in popularity across the country. Right now, there are more than 1,200 mass timber buildings either constructed or in the planning and design phase, which sounds maybe not like a lot considering how many buildings we are building in the country. However, it's a fast growth. In 2018, this map from our friends at Woodworks showed just 439 buildings. So that's both exciting because it means we have the potential to store a lot of carbon in these buildings and use materials with lower embodied carbon. But it also might be a little scary if we're not prepared to, A, ensure that we are using wood that comes from sustainably harvested forests that are protecting the carbon benefits of those forests as forests. And if we aren't thinking ahead about what are we going to do with the CLT and glue laminated timber, this mass timber, once this building in 50 or 100 years is ready to stop being a building, how are we going to use that mass timber in a good way? Just quickly touching on mass timber manufacturing, this increased demand in North America is we're starting already to see supply chain backups. People are having a hard time getting the mass timber they need for projects. We're starting to hear about delayed delivery timelines. And that means that we need to be manufacturing more mass timber in North America. And particularly, I would argue, in the Great Lakes region. Here's a map that shows the general location of mass timber manufacturers in North America. You'll see quite a lot clustered in the Pacific Northwest and Canada. We have a new manufacturer not on this map that's in Arkansas. Is that Alaska abbreviation I use? It's Arkansas. And then in Ontario, we have friends at Element 5. That's our nearest supplier of mass timber. And another one on this list that's kind of moving and shaking is called Vaughan in Washington, but we have none in Michigan. There are a few reasons for that. All of the currently certified all of the mass timber products that are certified for use in the United States are made from softwood. Michigan has softwood, but what we really have a lot of is hardwood. So it probably is going to make sense long-term if Michigan's going to start manufacturing mass timber at a large scale for us to be really thinking about hardwood. And the other reason is just that we haven't done the deep supply chain research that we need to do to really be ready to welcome a mass timber manufacturer to Michigan. But that work is in process. So in order to start thinking about mass timber manufacture in Michigan, Michigan State University is doing a few different things. We'll start with materials research. Dr. George Berghorn in the School of Planning, Design, and Construction under the Dome Ecology umbrella, started by Dr. Lamore on this call. He's working on developing cross-laminated timber and glue-laminated timber using wood salvaged from building deconstruction. This is an exciting potential way to use a lot of wood that might otherwise go into a landfill in another long-lived, durable use that I think has really strong implications for circular economies. We're also working to develop less toxic adhesives for our cross-laminated timber and other types of mass timber. This work is led by Dr. Mojgan Nejad in the Department of Forestry. She is using lignin, which is extracted from trees through a variety of different processes, as the basis of new adhesives and other products. But the one we're talking about right now is lignin-based adhesives with applications in CLT. She has a couple of contracts right now to implement this into products that are currently in development. This is an exciting thing. And these types of adhesives have a lot of potential when we think about circularity. Are they easier to break down if we want to convert cross-laminated timber that's been used in a building to some other use? Certainly for the health of our buildings, et cetera, it's great to have less toxic types of adhesives. This research is so exciting. And it's promising. We're seeing that in some cases with Mojgan's adhesives, a stronger shear strength result when applied versus the existing polyurethane types of adhesives. So keep watching this, it's very cool. Additional mass timber research at MSU. Where is my slide? Oh no, I hate when this happens. I'm sorry about that. There we go. So we've got supply chain analysis and forest economics research done by Dr. Raju Pokharel in forestry, really understanding where we might cite mass timber manufacturing based on existing wood supply. Our forest carbon and climate plan is working on a few different angles led by Dr. Kylie Clay, whose name is spelled with a C, C-L-A-Y. She's investigating important safeguards to ensure that our growing mass timber industry is based in sustainable forest practices and is based on forest carbon resilience and not creating some slippery slope that leads to, us backsliding into clear cutting as our way of life. As well as analyzing a variety of different wood products, harvested wood products, including mass timber, to understand how climate intensive they are based on where the supply is coming from, how they're manufactured, and how they're used. Dr. Berghorn, again, has created a predictive cost model to support the construction industry in making decisions about mass timber based on an array of different types of project costs. And then from a social dimensions and policy perspective, there's a few things happening. Dr. Emily Huff, also in forestry, is working to understand the positions of environmental NGOs related to mass timber. Very important, particularly as related to applying that knowledge to developing policies. And that's where I specialize. I'm really engaging a lot on policy matters related to mass timber manufacture and adoption here in Michigan, including some work with the Governor's Council on Climate Solutions. I see some key research opportunities at MSU, especially as I mentioned, related to end-of-life uses for mass timber. You know, a lot of times people say, well, we don't have any way to use these materials that have these adhesives in them. What are we going to do? And my answer is, well, yeah, we create new ways, right? We have to create new technologies. We have to do research and development to understand how do we break down the polyurethane adhesives that are in the mass timber? How can we safely use these? And, you know, what are some other uses? We've got to be creative. And, you know, whereas automobiles are currently in use and they have a short lifespan, buildings hopefully have a 50 to 100 year lifespan. So we need to kind of get cracking on this, but we have a little bit of time. Hardwood mass timber product development and supply chain analysis. I mentioned that hardwood's going to have to be a part of mass timber manufacture in Michigan in order to do so at scale. And then vertical integration opportunities for mass timber businesses in Michigan. Professor Lech Muzinski at Oregon State University has done a lot of research on how Europe has vertically integrated its mass timber industries in different ways and kind of right-sizing models to geographies and different types of wood sources. How can we do that here? What makes sense? You know, when is design a necessary part of your, like building design, a necessary part of your company's business model, and when is it not? You know, do you need to do it all? What parts can you do and what parts can you outsource in order to achieve maximum success, as well as maximum benefits when it comes to circularity? So I guess I'll stop there, but I just want to say, you know, I think mass timber offers a great opportunity to really apply circularity to an emerging industry where there's a lot at stake, but a lot of opportunity to do it really well. So I'm excited about what's going on at MSU already, and I'm excited about opportunities that this group can identify and take on together. I think interdisciplinary collaboration is going to be absolutely essential to success. And I look forward to always talking with you about mass timber and circularity and how we can work together. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lupien, for that excellent presentation and orientation to the potential for mass timber to be a part of our future circularity. Let's open it up for a few Q&A here from some of our colleagues that have joined us this afternoon. Any questions or comments for our colleagues?
Yeah, Rex, this is Dave Dio. I was just going to mention a couple of things relating to Sandra's presentation and to what you do. And that is something that would be akin to modular planning. So with CLT, you're building things in the form of modules and then shipping them to the place that they're going to go. If you plan in the building of those modules so that things in a big building are designed in such a way that when they're taken apart, they can go to a smaller building or even to a home, then you have an increased circularity in the context of using those modules over and over again. Then you don't have to worry about getting rid of the glue. And then the other thing I was going to mention as it relates to mass timber, and George and I have talked about this quite a bit, and that is, given the impacts of climate change and the effect of stress on forests and the increase in mortality, in forest management planning in the future, we are going to need to figure out a way to utilize that mortality as it occurs, whether it's from fire, insects, or disease, and be able to use the structural lumber that's still good after fire, insects, or disease, particularly insects or disease and fire, and be able to use that as part of the mass timber. And that would be, according to George, some of the internal components. So the outer layers would be your solid cut timber from the forest, your inner layers could be still structurally sound, but they would be these this waste wood that would normally go to a landfill or be burned in the forest. So that's all I needed to say to add to Sandra's circularity.
And you can also turn those dead trees into structural composite lumber members that can be turned into cross-laminated timber, glulam, which I think is super exciting. And David, as you know, it was the tree mortality in California that brought me on this wacky mass timber journey. So thank you for those remarks.
Yeah, well, dead trees are good for some things, I guess. We got you, didn't we, Sandra?
How interesting, David. What a clever idea. Build your mass timber structures with their end of use in mind, so that the end of use of the structure turns into other uses for that mass timber. Sort of take it apart and build something else with the same component parts. That's really circular thinking. Thank you, David.
You bet.
Other questions for our presenters?
Well, I was just going to comment because I'm reminded when Sandra was speaking that the threats to a lot of circle closing is not in necessarily the science or the engineering, it's in the social context. Does government understand? Will it get certified? Will it be fairly treated? Will people want or hate to have mass timber in the structures they live in? And so to me, it's almost as an afterthought, and this is the lesson from the autonomous vehicles, is that I'm fairly comfortable with the science behind a lot of innovations. What worries me is who educates the public, who educates the legislature, who shapes the narrative. And I'm just doing a study on tweets around smart cities, and the social media narrative of smart cities is all coming from vendors. There are no urban planners, there's no city managers, 4.7 million tweets, and most of them are coming from vendors. And so I'm really intrigued about trying to stop the barriers that allow us to close the circle, as it would be, because those barriers are going to be social rather than scientific.
That's so true of mass timber too, Mark. I mean, the who's shaping the dialogue is the industry for sure. And I think there's some things about that that are great. And at the same time, you know, if that's the only voice, then naturally, because their incentives are different from, you know, perhaps my incentives, the story is going to be more. And it's not going to be yes, more, and let's do it this way. And that's what motivates me to do my work for sure.
So Mark and Sandra, if I could keep you guys engaged in that dialogue for a minute. So Mark, you asked the question who, and it's more like how does MSU shape that dialogue, I guess would be my question back at both of you. And Sandra, if I may, in this context, thank you very much for a very informative tour of the STEM building. What a fascinating building that is. And I appreciate the 30 minutes that you devoted of your time to tour me around the building. And Mark, you and I met 2 years ago in my first summer on campus when I was touring with your new director. I think you were the only person in the building that day.
I was lucky.
I was lucky that day. Fascinated by both your work, but I guess I challenged Michigan State to be the who in terms of the how, and then maybe in the context of build back better, regardless of your political persuasion, how does, the timing may be actually very perfect. But I would leave it up to you guys to maybe help us determine how best we be a loud voice in that conversation.
And I think this is a crucial juncture simply because the automatic reaction post-COVID is we want to get back to normal. And normal was not particularly good. Normal had a lot of problems. But how do you take people who are clamoring for an equilibrium, a return to normalcy, when you're saying, oh, let's do something completely different? So on top of the 2 years risk of COVID, we're now going to say we're going to make our buildings different. We're going to use different forms of mobility. We have all these great ideas. I think it's really hard to be reassuring about the future, but many of us don't want to go back, yet that is going to be the default human reaction, I think, is let's claw back to what we had and reset ourselves for 2 years ago when I don't think we want to do that. But how do you make that argument to the public? It's a difficult thing to do.
Well, this is David again. From my perspective, the how is to focus on young millennials and Generation Z cohorts. And that's what we've got in high school now and at Michigan State. And those, in my mind, those are the people that are going to be the drivers of kind of the new economy going forward. We just have to give them our support and our knowledge so that they can do it in the right way.
Yeah, no, I would agree. And our students give me a great deal of hope, because when you talk to the students at MSU, they're very forward-looking. They have a much more expansive view of inclusion than in the past. And they're much more environmentally aware than they have been in the past. So I have a lot of hope, but it's a matter of we need to reach more than that. And how do you reach? And if you're in high school doing a project, will you find the information that will support you, or will this information be from sources that are in fact counter to what the science tells us we should do?
I do think one thing, David, that you mentioned, it's, you know, millennials and Gen Z too are much, I think they tend to be much more intersectional thinkers, which is amazing and really, really helpful for these types of solutions, right? Whereas, you know, I'm Gen X, and I know we've got some Gen X, we've got some boomers on this call. Like, I think our generations have tended to be a little bit more siloed in their thinking. That's changing, like a lot. And I think that bodes well for us.
Any more questions for our panelists? Comments?
So only one observational question. It's just mostly about transparency of data information. And I think that is crucial regarding any circular economy process that we want to take. And as Dr. Wilson said regarding the data and the technology, I'm not worried about that we will always have a new technology to come forward to solve a problem, because that's what we tend to do. The problem is that I think the transparency of the data and long-term use of the data seems that we move forward very quickly with that. And then I don't think circularity works in that way. So I think that part of the large implementation that we do, and I think that I'm from packaging, so I like to be material neutral. I'm not one material over other, because I think that it depends always. That is the answer. So then I'm all forward to use different materials, but it will depend on the application. So I think that it will be interesting to see all this transparency and how the new generation is absorbing this complexity of the data and the transparency of the data to make the decision. And that is something that I'm a little worried when we actually put always about like a flag that one thing is better than other. I think that the data and the things should speak by themselves, and then circularity will take care of that, and we'll look at that. But if the problem is that when we just put always flags or something is better than other, always come to the situation that 10 or 50 years from now, we find out that, oh, there was the intended consequence that we never actually thought about that. So I think that I would like that in this journey that we are, the transparency of the data always there for all the educational students. And I think that is the same thing with the MassTimber and all the process. So it's just an observation, but I think that is great to do there. It would be great to have all the data there to support that.
Yeah. And I would agree about the transparency. I think one of my concerns is that increasingly data is proprietary, that it's owned by corporations and it's controlled, it's removed from the public sphere. I mean, it used to be in the old days that the government collected data and just gave it away. And now in many fields, you end up having to buy data, or data aren't released. And so I think that the transparency is incredibly important as an element in the process. The question is, will that data be revealed? Is Tesla going to tell us about their vehicles and their accidents? Will Ford, will GM tell us about their autonomous vehicle data? They're going to sit on it because it's a corporate asset. And that's what worries me. And I believe we should be promoting greater transparency in the information we have around these new technologies.
Well, let me thank our panelists and thank you for your thoughtful presentation and helping us understand some of the critical issues surrounding circularity and how we might advance it. I'm reminded by Dr. Wilson's comments that the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and that while we might be pursuing what we believe to be a more sustainable and just world and circular economy, we need to be cautious of the shortcomings of that thinking and be the critical thinkers I think we're all trained to be.
Should you wish to learn more about the Circular Economy Institute and the related topic of extended producer responsibility, visit the website ced.msu.edu. And thank you for your time, and if you wish to learn more about the topic, please contact the faculty who participated in the informal forum or contact the MSU CCED at ced@msu.edu.